So, Arsenal finally win the Premier League, and immediately the internet starts doing what it always does. Weak error, low points total, no prime City, no prime Liverpool, one of the worst champions ever. Now, I think football fans are completely losing perspective here, because if we're talking about weak Premier League title winners, Arsenal's recent side shouldn't even be in the conversation. Not when Premier League history includes title-winning teams finishing on points totals in the 70s and low 80s. And just to be clear, I'm not here to tell you that all of these other sides that I'm going to mention in this video are bad. It's actually the opposite. This video is about context of how football has changed. Many football fans today judge title-winning teams by modern Manchester City standards. You know, points totals in the 90s, pushing for 100, relentless domination. But the Premier League wasn't always like that. The 90s and early 2000s were chaotic. The league was less tactically refined, squads were thinner, top teams dropped points constantly. So today we're going to go through some of the weakest title-winning teams in Premier League history, comparing squads, comparing records, comparing performances in other competitions, and explaining why Arsenal's latest title win is nowhere near the bottom. Firstly, let's deal with Arsenal, because the criticism around this title feels massively exaggerated. Modern football discourse has become completely warped by Guardiola's Manchester City. Anything below 90 points now gets treated like mediocrity, but historically that's nonsense. This Arsenal side all season has dominated defensively, controlled games, had elite underlying numbers, including actually their goals scored as well, despite criticism of their attacking play, and they've won the league in an era where the tactical level across the league is probably the highest it's ever been. This run didn't feel like Leicester surviving every week. This wasn't a transitional side stealing a title during chaos. This was an elite football team. People also ignore how difficult modern title races are. Mid-table teams now spend hundreds of millions, pressing structures are sophisticated, data recruitment is elite, even relegation teams can dominate possession at times and give you a challenge. Compare that to the past, where defense often only started once the opponents were anywhere near your box, and you start to see the evolution of football. This doesn't mean that all the teams were bad, it just means football has evolved. And when you actually compare Arsenal's squad quality man for man with some historical title winners, things can get very interesting. Let's start with an obvious one. Manchester United winning the 1996-1997 Premier League title with just 75 points. Today that might get you a top 4 place. For context, Arsenal's recent side have finished 10 points above them. And this United side was obviously not one of Ferguson's best. Eric Cantona was ageing, Roy Keane missed huge chunks of the season, and the attack lacked consistency all year round. Now, this team still had some incredible individuals: Peter Schmeichel, Beckham, Giggs, Cantona, Keane, but as a collective league-winning side, they were vulnerable. They lost 7 league games, they drew 9, and they only scored 76 goals. Compare that to some of the modern champions and you start to see that there's a massive difference. Also, in Europe, this side got knocked out in the semi-finals of the Champions League to a very good Dortmund side. Now, this one is controversial and will definitely ruffle some feathers, because the 1999 treble winners are obviously iconic, and rightly so. Football heritage-wise, one of the greatest teams ever, but purely as a league champion, they won the title with 79 points. They only won it by 1 point. They lost 3 times during the run-in, and domestically they were nowhere near as dominant as modern champions. Similarly to other treble-winning sides like Man City recently, or teams like Inter and Bayern and other leagues, a lot has to go right to win a treble. And what makes these teams legendary usually isn't league dominance, and in this case for Manchester United it certainly wasn't. It was mentality, big moments and cup. The depth and clutch factor were ridiculous. But this side clearly was never cut out for a modern title race. They were never going to reach 90 plus points. No chance. Still an all-time great team, but not an all-time dominant domestic league champion. Then we have the 2000-2001 Manchester United side. Another title, another relatively low points total, only 80. And honestly, this might be one of Ferguson's least talked about champions, because it just wasn't a spectacular team. United won the league largely because nobody else could keep up. Arsenal had dropped off, Liverpool weren't ready to compete, and Chelsea hadn't become what they would become soon. The league overall was weaker tactically and financially, and despite winning comfortably, this United side lost 6 games, conceded 45 goals, and did nothing in Europe. Again, this team consisted of some great players, a great manager, but they were not an all-time title winning machine. Now, there is another elephant in the room here. The Leicester City season of 2015-2016, the greatest underdog story in football history and simultaneously one of the weakest Premier League champions ever. Both things can be true. Leicester won that season with 81 points, but more importantly, the traditional big clubs completely imploded. The previous season's title winners, who we will talk about in a moment, Mourinho's Chelsea side, had completely collapsed. United were transitioning, City were inconsistent, Arsenal did Arsenal things, Tottenham did Tottenham things, and Liverpool was still rebuilding too. Leicester absolutely deserved the title that season. They were incredibly organised, Kante covered the entire planet, Mahrez had a supernatural season, and Vardy turned into prime R9 for 6 months. But purely in terms of overall squad quality, this is probably the weakest champion of the modern era. Look at the 11 outside of the star players. Huth, Morgan, Albrighton, Drinkwater, Simpson. These are solid players, they're cult heroes, but compared to elite title-winning squads historically, it's not even close. That's what makes the achievement insane and what it is. I've just named you 4 teams over the past 30 years, so it would be fair to say that if there's not that many teams over such a long period of time, then the Arsenal team is still worthy of criticism. And to some extent they are. However, it's a narrative game, because just last season, Liverpool are definitely in that discussion as well. I actually do think they are a weaker modern champion than Arsenal. Not terrible champions, not flukes, but compared to the great Premier League winning sides, there's definitely some questions there as well. That Liverpool squad finished on 84 points in Slot's first season. That's 1 point less than this Arsenal team. Now, let's be clear, that's a respectable points total, but historically it's nowhere near the elite modern standards set by Guardiola's City, Klopp's Liverpool sides, Conte's Chelsea, Mourinho's first Chelsea, or even some of the Wenger sides. And context matters here. This wasn't the terrifying 2019-20 Liverpool machine that looked capable of getting 105 points before COVID. This version was far more vulnerable. The midfield control wasn't as overwhelming, the press wasn't so intense, and defensively they looked shaky in transition at times. A huge amount of the success of that season depended on Mohamed Salah producing ridiculous numbers again. Even Liverpool fans admitted how reliant the attack became on him by the second half of the season. Now, to be fair, Slot winning the league in his first season after replacing Klopp is undeniably impressive. He inherited enormous pressure, he stabilised the club quickly, and tactically he made Liverpool more controlled in possession. But his title also came during a season where the traditional power balance looked unstable. City dropped off from their absurd peak levels, Arsenal had injury and consistency issues, United were nowhere near contention, Chelsea still weren't fully rebuilt, and when Liverpool came up against elite opposition in cup competitions, the cracks showed. They lost the EFL Cup final to Newcastle, and in Europe they went out in the Champions League round of 16, albeit to the eventual Paris Saint-Germain champions. Again, they're good champions, they're deserved champions, but if we're ranking Premier League winners purely on strength, this Liverpool side sits much closer to the middle or even lower middle than people want to admit in the past 10 years. I mean, they didn't even have to have a title race because of how far every other team had slipped down. So where would I draw the line finally reaching a team that I believe is on the same level as this Arteta Arsenal side? Well, that would be the 14-15 Chelsea team under Mourinho's comeback team. It's a fascinating one because the narrative around them is weirdly positive historically. People remember them as a dominant team, but in reality, they're very similar in terms of style of play, players, and everything in between to this Arsenal side. That title race collapsed around them. Chelsea finished on 87 points, very respectable total, but the football by the second half of the season became incredibly conservative, similar to this Arsenal team. In attack, I would argue that they definitely had a couple more maverick sort of players. You know, Diego Costa was brilliant, Hazard was world class that season, Terry and Cahill were controlling the boxes defensively as well, but compare them stylistically to modern elite sides and it's night and day. They slowed games down constantly, protected leads and killed tempo, same way Arsenal have this season. Effective for sure, but aesthetically and tactically they were nowhere near peak City, Liverpool, or even some of the Wenger sides of the 2000s. And in Europe they weren't elite either. PSG knocked them out in the round of 16 despite PSG playing with 10 men for a large part of the tie. That's not exactly all-time champion behaviour. Now what you will have noticed by this point in the video is that I've been talking a lot about points totals, because points totals obviously are important. It's the only metric that decides whether you win the league or not, really. But points totals do lie, and I think the best case study for that is Antonio Conte's Chelsea side of 2016-17. On paper, they look like they'd be in an opposite video, one of the best sides in Premier League history. I mean, 93 points, 30 wins, a then record 13 straight victories in the league, and a tactical system that changed the league. And to be fair, there was a lot to admire. Conte switched to the back three after losing to Arsenal and Liverpool early in the season, and suddenly nobody could cope. Hazard was unplayable, Kante vacuumed up the midfield, Diego Costa bullied centre-backs week in, week out. Even Victor Moses looked like a world-class player for a while. Tactically, this Chelsea side absolutely felt modern. Compact defensively, deadly in transition, wing-backs creating overloads, automated movement patterns. Compared to some chaotic 90s title winners, yes, this Chelsea side looked far more sophisticated. But this is where context matters, because Chelsea had one huge advantage that often goes unmentioned for a large part of the season. And historically, that is a massive advantage in England, where we have two cup competitions. While rivals were getting dragged through European fixtures every few days, Chelsea were resting, recovering, training, preparing tactically. Conte could basically play the same core 11 every single week, and once you realise that, the season starts to look slightly different. Now, this Chelsea side didn't have Europe because the previous year under Mourinho they had finished 10th, and this season after Conte's title-winning side, they actually finished 5th as well, so they were nowhere near dominant. They didn't look anything like a historic dynasty, and there was no sustained greatness. It felt more like a perfect storm season, a brilliant coach, an ideal tactical setup, minimal fixture congestion, peak Hazard, peak Kante, and yes, they absolutely deserve the title yet again, as all of these teams did, but this is why points totals alone can be misleading, because 93 points sounds historically dominant, until you remember they were basically operating under conditions that elite teams just don't get anymore. Now, compare that to teams juggling Champions League quarterfinals, domestic cups, international fatigue, injuries, and 60-game seasons, and suddenly the achievement becomes a little less untouchable. Still a great side, but maybe not quite the unstoppable all-time giant that some people suggest they are. I think, honestly, that Conte team is quite comparable to this current Arsenal team as well. So, in conclusion, title winners are title winners. You can't really take that away from them. They win because they deserve it over a 38-game season. But if we really need to discuss who the weakest Premier League champions are ever, if we're combining the squad quality, tactical level, dominance, depth, and historical comparisons, then honestly the shortlist probably looks something like the Leicester side of 2016 and those three United sides I mentioned, 97, 99, and 2001. Arsenal's recent champions should not be in the debate there. Football fans have just been spoiled recently by the insane points totals set by Pep and Klopp. The endless robotic consistency has now become something that we expect in football, and maybe that's the real takeaway. Modern football has changed how we define greatness, because sometimes the best teams aren't the ones with the highest points totals, and sometimes the legendary champions were way less dominant than nostalgia wants you to remember. I believe these back-to-back 84-point and 85-point title-winning seasons from Liverpool and Arsenal, they showcase that we're going into a different era of football, and maybe these points totals of the past won't be so expected anymore. Know some of your suggestions for the weakest Premier League champions ever in the comments, and let me know if you disagreed with anything I said in the video. If you found this video at all insightful or enjoyed the breakdown, please do consider subscribing.